So this kind of breaks our ideas of national boundaries and language and religious boundaries. But Marco Polo is the classic example of this, right? He was technically a Venetian, but he spent his formative years in his 20s and 30s working in the Mongol Yuan court as an official and getting a salary. And that was not that unusual for ambitious Genoese or Venetians. Um, Sometimes working as administrators, sometimes they're working as mercenaries. But the idea that your boss might be a Mongol from a medieval Italian perspective, that's actually not shocking.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for listening to the second edition of the Asia Center podcast. My name is Will Hedberg. I'm the director of the Asia Center, and I am delighted to welcome my colleague from ASU School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, Professor Hannah Barker. Professor Barker is an associate professor of history whose research centers on the medieval period with focus on connections between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. She is the author of the award-winning study, That Most Precious Merchandise, The Mediterranean Trade in Black Sea Slaves, 1260 to 1500, which won the Paul E. Lovejoy Prize from the Journal of Global Slavery and the ASU Humanities Institute Book Prize. Professor Barker is back from a sabbatical at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and we are here to talk about her second project. Professor Barker, welcome.
Thank you.
So your first project on the slave trade of the late medieval period was interdisciplinary, translingual, comparative in the very richest senses of the words. And your second project is even more epic. You're looking at the Mongol Empire and its connections across Eurasia with focus on relations between Genoa, Venice, and the Golden Horde. Well, we could talk about some of those terms later. Can you tell us a little bit about the parameters of this project and how it connects to your earlier research?
So the second project is actually in certain respects going to be narrower than the first one. On the second project, I'm focusing more on slavery within Genoa, but a lot of the slaves are the same people that I focused on in my first project, people who are coming from the Black Sea, a large percentage of whom are Tatar or Mongol. And what I'm interested in the second project is, how is slavery legally defined? And how are people who are enslaved able to challenge that category? So what kicked this off was that in Genoa, I found a really interesting set of we call them freedom suits or freedom petitions, where an enslaved person goes to court and says, I have been illegally enslaved and I should actually be free.
Hmm.
So I'm fascinated by this. I want to know, how do people prove that they're supposed to be free? Like, what kind of evidence would you show? How would you even get that evidence? Why is this something that the Genoese state allows? Right. Um, so in some ways, this project is taking me more into Italy and a little bit away from the Black Sea. But the third book I wanna write is about slave trade within the Black Sea, and that one will be a very Mongol-focused book. So I'm kind of bouncing back and forth in terms of where the geographical center is, but this phenomenon of slavery and how it ties the Black Sea and the Mediterranean together, it relates to all of them.
And can we talk a little bit about kind of the geographic and temporal stage? Um, you know, it seems like the center of the works you shared with me were Venice, Genoa, and then cities on the Black Sea coast. And I'm wondering, for listeners new to this topic, roughly when and where are we in global history?
So this is, roughly speaking, mid 13th century to mid 15th century. Um, Genoa and Venice during this time were major trading hubs in the Mediterranean in the east and the west, and major shipping hubs. If you wanted to travel in the Mediterranean, there are high odds that you could end up on a Genoese or Venetian ship. And so they were interested in having outposts in the Black Sea, mainly for trading purposes, both to get access to local goods. Grain was a very important one. That region, I mean, today, Ukraine continues to be a major grain producer, and Bulgaria and Romania, that whole region as well. So Genoa and Venice, neither of them are grain producing regions. Venice is in the middle of the water. Genoa is in a very mountainous area. So they wanted access to that kind of trade, but it's also long distance Silk Road network type trading outpost. So Genoa and Venice have their fingers in many pies when it comes to trade. They certainly wanted to be involved in the Black Sea. In the 13th century, there's a period where, because of the Fourth Crusade, the Byzantine control over access to the Black Sea was broken, and the Venetians really took advantage of that to establish some outposts in the Black Sea. In the late 13th century, the Byzantines come back, and so they kick out the Venetians. Anyone who's the enemy of the Venetians is their friend, and so they let the Genoese in. So the story of the 14th century is Genoese and Venetian competition for who is actually gonna dominate trade with the Mongols in that area. This lasts into the 15th century. In the 15th century, the sort of end of my story is the Ottoman takeover of the Black Sea, which doesn't end Black Sea Mediterranean connections, but it's a different set of sources, it's a different administrative structure, different languages.
And the center for the project you shared with me, you looked at 2 cities, one of which, Tana,
Mhm.
is under control of or dominated by the Venetians. Kaffa is dominated by the Genoans.
Yes.
It's a very fraught political situation. You talked about the
Yeah.
relations of the Byzantine with the Jochid state, the
Mhm.
Golden Horde. How do these 2 particular cities come into being?
So Tana was a Venetian trade outpost with a big Venetian population, a big Tatar population as well, local people, and various other kinds of people came there to trade. Armenians, Greeks, people from all over the place. So it's a very diverse city. It was a Venetian trade hub, but it was under the administrative control of the Jochids, the
Mhm.
Mongols. Kaffa was the Genoese trading hub. It had a big Genoese population, but it also had Venetians and Greeks and Armenians and all these other people, so also very diverse. The difference there was that Genoa had administrative control. They had an unwritten treaty with the Jochids saying that they were allowed to manage the port, collect taxes there, etc. Um, but the very convenient thing about having it being unwritten is if anyone wanted to tweak the terms, there's nothing to compare it with. Um,
And this became a major problem later when
yes,
conflict emerges between the Jochids and the
yes,
Genoans, right?
yes, yes.
A few weeks ago, our colleague Mark Cruz presented his research on medieval France's relations
Mm,
to the Mongol Empire, and one of the points I really took away from that was just how much modern nationalism really interferes with our ability to discuss the pre-modern world. A lot of our historiography on relations between the Mongol Empire and Europe are these very kind of stark binaries. Europe versus Asia, Christian versus non, and it seems clear that not only is that, like wildly inaccurate oversimplification, but the actors themselves did not think in these terms and categories at all. Um, what were Mongol relations with Genoa and Venice like in regions like these Black Sea cities? This might be a really vague question, but what might kind of daily life look like in a place like Tana or Kaffa, where Venetians, Genoans, Armenians, Greeks are in close contact with the Jochid state and the Tatars, had friendships, had tensions. Is there any way to get a sense of kind of what these daily interactions look like in this contact zone?
So, my best window into daily life is that there are in Italian archives today in Genoa and Venice, there are notarial registers. So, these are notaries were legal professionals whose job it was to write legal documents in the proper way so that they would be binding, right? And they were doing this in the Genoese and Venetian legal traditions, but when they're in some place like Caffa or Tana, they are not only serving Genoese or Venetian clients. All kinds of people come to them to record documents. And so you can get a sense of, there's a Genoese merchant who is resident in Caffa this year to do some business, and he's renting a house from an Armenian, and he has a Greek woman who is cooking and cleaning for him as a paid servant, and then so it we can see certain details like that of the interactions between people, but then there are the kinds of details that don't necessarily make it into
Mhm.
a legal document, like who is drinking in the tavern together. Unless someone gets murdered, that's probably not gonna get into a legal system, right? Um so the social relationships can be really difficult to trace. But one of the articles that I shared with you was about a really unique source that is a memoir. It was a Venetian man from a very elite family who had traveled in his youth to Tana and spent some time there as a merchant. Then he went back to Venice and had a very illustrious political career. And late in his life, he wrote it's a travel memoir. So he focuses less on his political life and more about his time in Mongol lands. And he tells all kinds of wild stories, which are not the kind of things that you would get in legal documents. So putting that together with the legal documents for me was a really interesting experience.
And can we talk about that case study? It's a really fascinating instance of,
Mm.
you call it a friendship, but a friendship with qualifications,
Right.
that's emerging in a very complicated, fraught, politically unequal situation. But it's a really fascinating story, and I thought a really fascinating way to tell history from this more kind of emotional vantage point. Can you tell us a little bit about this figure?
Sure. So the Venetian who wrote this memoir, his name was Joseph Barbaro. And he is sort of telling his story about his experiences in Tana, and then later in life, he goes in as an ambassador to Persia, which is a different Tatar state. But he kind of lumps this together as his experiences with the Tatars. And he kind of interrupts this story to have this sort of meditation on friendship, and he tells 2 stories. One story is about his interactions when he was young with someone who was a more senior Tatar noble whose name was Edelmulk. And so he, met with Edelmulk and they went drinking together and they got so drunk. And he tells all the stories about how drunk they got and all the crazy things that they did. And Edelmulk offers him to adopt his son, not in a literal way, but to create sort of a stronger friendship, kinship between them.
Mhm.
Um, and then, in the end, Josephat goes back to Venice and has the rest of his career. But decades later, he's back in the neighborhood, doing his business as an ambassador, and he runs into the son, the guy who he had adopted when he was a little child, and he recognizes him because of these ongans, these sort of images that they have. Wait, I know who you are. So this is and then the son helps him in his travels at that point. So that's the first half. And then the second half is a story about another guy named Quebecji, who he knew when he was in Tana the first time. They went and had dinner together. There was a big fire in Tana, and he helped him escape through the city walls, made a hole in the city walls so they could get out. Um, and then again, decades later, he meets Quebecji in Venice as a slave
Mhm.
and immediately says, "Well, this can't stand," and takes him. And Quebecji has another Tatar friend who's enslaved with them. He just takes them both and goes to the Signore di Notte. This is effectively the night watch, the police in Venice, and says, "These men are not slaves. Their owner doesn't actually own them. I'm taking them to my house." And the Signore di Notte apparently were okay with this, which is surprising. And so he puts them back on a ship to Tana. And the moral of these stories paired together is that you should never forget about friends because you never know in the future when you might meet them again, and the person who helped you, you will be able to help them. And for him, pairing these stories is very important because in the first story, he is the junior partner in the friendship. And this is something that I think when a lot of people think about European Mongol relations, they tend to think of Mongols as being very alien, very scary.
Mhm.
This kind of rhetoric comes out of the first wave of the Chinggisid invasions, right? There is that kind of rhetoric in European sources. But this memoir is 200 plus years after that. At that point in time, Venetians and Mongols have known each other for generations. They've been trading with each other for generations. Sometimes they fight over who's going to control this port and who's going to control that port, but this is not an alien group of people. This is a people who they've been interacting with for literally centuries at this point, and they share a certain kind of elite culture. So going drinking together, going hunting together, riding horses together. These are things Venetians do. These are things Mongols do. These are things they can do together and sort of share their noble status. So he's on the one hand, he's able to interact with Edelmulk in this way and feel like they have this very close connection. But on the other hand, he's very young. Edelmulk is much more senior. So he tells this story about how Edelmulk's son later on in his life was able to help him. But The other thing about Josephat Barbaro is he is a Renaissance intellectual,
Mhm.
and he has an idea of friendship that is very much built on humanist models derived from classical texts. So on that model, friendship is supposed to be equal. It's not supposed to be instrumental. It's supposed to be two noble, high-spirited men coming together without any of this dirty utilitarian stuff. And it should be equal. And so if he has someone doing a favor for him, he needs to tell a second story to balance it where he's the one who's able to do a favor
Hmm.
in order to show that this is not for he's not in it for gain,
Mm.
right? He's an appropriately humanistic, noble person. So the second story where he's able to rescue someone apparently effortlessly from slavery, that was the story that first got my attention because I was collecting information about slavery. But that story is radically different from any other description of slavery I have from that period, and it took me a long time to understand how to interpret it. Um, but it's because he wants to portray this relationship between himself and individual Mongols, between Venetians and Mongols in a more general way. It is a friendly relationship, but it's also a dynamic relationship. When they're in Venice, he's the one who has the upper hand, but when he's in Tana, it's the Mongols who have the upper hand. And that's something that I think doesn't fit our modern stereotypes at all.
Mhm. How would this Tatar slave have ended up in Venice in the 15th century?
In the 15th century.
What were the mechanisms by which this person came all the distance from this port city on the Black Sea all the way to the Mediterranean?
So for this individual, we don't have the story, but we do know what the broader patterns are. So how people become enslaved in the Black Sea, especially people of that class, right? Upper class men, probably he was captured in a war or a raid of some
Mhm.
kind. In this particular case, we don't know who was doing the fighting, but we can look at civil conflicts. We can look at one group in the Black Sea raiding another group. There are individuals who you can tie to particular campaigns. This one, I wasn't able to tie to a particular campaign, but I would expect he was taken captive in some kind of violent situation,
Mhm.
right? Um, but then captives, this is one of the ways that people, not just in the Black Sea, in other parts of the Mediterranean as well, one of the ways that you profit from war is selling the people that you catch. So in the Black Sea context, this means bringing the captives to one of these ports, to Tana or Kaffa. There are other ports as well, but those are the two big ones, and sell them to merchants. So Italian merchants are not personally going into the hinterland and kidnapping people.
Mhm.
They are waiting for war captives or raiding captives to be brought to them, and then they can pick and choose who they're going to buy and put them on a ship. And the ships usually go south across the Black Sea, along the Anatolian coast to Constantinople. They usually stop in Constantinople. Both Genoa and Venice had big merchant communities there, so they would sell some cargo, pick up some other cargo. So maybe some slaves would be sold there. Then they would go on into the Aegean, and again, Venetians control certain islands, Genoese control other islands. They're constantly fighting with each other over islands, but they would stop somewhere, get some information, get some fresh supplies, sell some slaves, buy some other stuff, continue on, and then eventually make their way back either to Genoa or to Venice. Um, the particular individual in this story was owned at some point by Catalans. And Catalan merchants are involved in this network as well, but not so much in the Black Sea, more in the Aegean or the Mediterranean. So my guess would be that Edelmulg went through multiple hands. He got captured by someone somewhere. He was trafficked into the Aegean or the Mediterranean, probably on a Genoese or Venetian ship, but it could have been a different ship. Some Catalan merchants bought him. He, at some point, tried to escape in a boat, but he and his friend were picked up by Venetians. So now he's in Venetian hands, working in a Venetian wine shop. And that's where Josephat finds him. And that's what's really unusual is the fact that he decided to intervene in
Mhm.
that case.
And I assume we don't have any source of information from the Tatar's points of view.
No,
Everything is from Josephat Barbaro's.
everything is from Josephat Barbaro's point of
Mhm.
view. For this period in general, there was an archive, but a lot of that material in later historical periods has been lost.
Okay.
So this is, and particularly for these individuals, this is something where we only have it from the one point of view. So maybe Josaphat is exaggerating, maybe he's bending the details a
Mhm.
little bit. This is why I looked at friendship as a framework for this, right? If he is bending the details, what is it that he's trying to emphasize?
And so even accounted for the fact that, we only have one point of view, that, as you said earlier, in some ways he's probably shaping his memories in such a way as to accord with these Renaissance ideals of friendship. Kind of even factoring all that in, is there any evidence that, what we see in this particular anecdote might have been a fairly common, or, a fairly common mode of interaction between these two groups? These kind of close, close, close friendship, close relationships in some way, emotional.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's definitely both. I mean, the legal evidence, you can see Italians and Mongols and Tatars interacting with each other closely. We also have really good records of diplomatic interactions.
Mm.
So the fact that he went as an ambassador later in life, that's actually not unusual. There is a lot of back and forth between Genoese and Venetians on the one hand and Mongol courts on the other hand. They bring gifts to each other, and we have very good records of that because they accounted for everything that they brought. There are also a lot of Genoese and Venetians who, especially in the 13th and 14th century, go and work in Mongol courts. They take jobs. So this is, again, this kind of breaks our ideas of national boundaries and language and religious boundaries. But Marco Polo is the classic example of this, right? He was technically a Venetian, but he spent his formative years in his 20s and 30s working in the Mongol Yuan court as an official and getting a salary. And that was not that unusual for ambitious Genoese or Venetians.
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes working as administrators, sometimes they're working as mercenaries. But the idea that your boss might be a Mongol from a medieval Italian perspective, that's actually not shocking.
Unusual, not
Yeah,
unusual.
yeah,
That's really fascinating. Um, the flip side of that, then, we talked about this instance from the 15th century, from the point of view of connection, friendship, some form of cultural commensurability. You've also studied moments of crisis.
yeah,
I'm thinking of one article of yours in particular dealing with the murder of a Mongol by a Venetian in 1343, and the ways in which Venetians, Genoans, and the Jochid state, the Golden Horde, the Mongols, if I can use those interchangeably.
yeah. It's, so the Jochid state is one of four Mongol states.
Okay.
Broadly speaking, Mongol is sort of a narrow category for elite people, and then Tatar is a bigger category that includes Mongols, but it also includes a lot of their subjects that might speak different languages and things like that. So I'm speaking right now and using Tatar and Mongol kind of interchangeably. Often, though, in the primary sources, and not just European sources, when we're looking at sources from all around the world during this time who are talking about this phenomenon, they tend to use Mongol in the sort of narrower noble sense, and then Tatar is kind of the broader population.
I see. So this would be this incident in 1343 where a Tatar is murdered by a Venetian leads to this really complicated political moment where Venetians, Genoans, and Tatars are all trying to use this to advance their own interests. This three-way conflict. Can you talk about this incident and
Right.
its aftermath? Because it's world historically uh,
It has consequences.
consequences. Yeah.
So yeah, so there's this moment in the 1340s where we already know the Genoese and Venetians are vying for control of the Black Sea for commercial purposes, right? But the ports on land, which they're trying to control, the hinterland of this is all controlled by the Jochids, right? And so this is kind of a tricky situation to negotiate because in the big picture, it is in all of their interests to be trading with each other. That's how they make money. But the Jochids would like more control over these ports. They had ceded a lot of control over Kaffa to the Genoese. They had not ceded administrative control over Tana to the Venetians, but there are a lot of Venetians in Tana, right? And so there's a what happens in the 1340s is there's a new Khan, Yanibek, who inherits, and he wants a harder line against the Italians. It's not that he doesn't want to trade with them. He does. You don't want to kill the goose that's laying the golden egg, but he wants a bigger share of the tax. He wants to collect the taxes. He wants a bigger share of the profits. He wants better terms for the Tatar merchants, his own people, right? Um, so he uses this murder, but I don't think the murder is anything particularly special. This is a diverse port. There are lots of men. They're out drinking together. Sometimes violence happens. Sometimes people insult each other's honor, right? But for him, this is a pretext to intervene. And so he says, "Oh, this Phoenician has killed my precious Tatar subject. This means I have to take control of Tana." And he does, and arrests all the Italian merchants, both Venetians and Genoese, that he can get his hands on, which make the Genoese very upset because it's not their fault that this murder happened.
This is in Kaffa?
This is in Tana.
I'm so sorry,
Yeah. And so he takes control of Tana first, arrests a bunch of merchants, and seizes all their goods. Anyone who can escape gets on ships and flees, and they all flee to Kaffa. So the next stage is for him to attack Kaffa. And this puts the Genoese and the Venetians in a very uneasy alliance because usually they're competing with each other. But all of a sudden they have to collaborate against Yanibek, and they're not fully comfortable with this. So they're trying to organize defenses for Kaffa. Um, they're trying to decide whether the Venetians will be allowed to trade in Kaffa on equal terms with the Genoese, and the Genoese first say that they'll do it, but then they kind of back off a little bit. It's just uneasy. And another thing they agree on is that they're going to have a trade embargo. They are not going to trade with the Jochids, with their merchants, until this political situation is resolved, which they agree about this on a political level, but immediately individual merchants start smuggling because, of course, they do, right? So then they have to decide how to punish the smugglers and exactly which ports does the embargo apply to. And there's just all this wrangling, and there's a couple sieges of Tana during this period. There's one siege, which fails, and then they kind of take a break, and then they come back, and there's another Tatar siege of Tana. So this is a complicated political situation. In the middle of this is new research that was published yesterday. In 1345, somewhere in the world, we haven't identified exactly where yet, there was a series of volcanic eruptions. The volcanic eruptions, these were really big ones. They put a lot of dust and sulfur into the atmosphere. They caused atmospheric cooling. And so we see this in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. 1346 and 1347 for northern Europe are disastrous. There's heavy rainfall in the spring, massive soil erosion, crops are destroyed, harvests are destroyed. So by the time you get to 1347, this political wrangling in the Black Sea has been going on and on and on. The Jochids have decided that they're also going to embargo the Venetians and Genoese and not trade with them either. But the hunger in not just Venice and Genoa, but other parts of Europe, because their crops are failing because of this it's a short-term shift, but it's a significant short-term shift in the climate. They're desperate, and their normal other places to buy grain are not working. The Black Sea, we said, is a major grain exporting region. So all of a sudden, the pressure is on to make peace and do it now. And they do. So in the spring 1347, Venetians go first and make peace with the Jochids. The Genoese do it a little bit after that. Both sides lift their embargoes. So now Tatars are allowed to trade with Italians. Italians are allowed to trade with Tatars. The nicest piece of evidence we have for this is a Venetian Senate decree saying that ships should go to the Black Sea immediately. They should buy grain and come back, nothing else, only grain. And if they go there and there's no grain available, they have to come back empty.
Hmm.
So they are really looking for grain because of this famine situation. And the problem is that at this time is when the Black Death is starting to spread, right? The Yersinia pestis bacteria, um, it's already affecting Tatar areas, but because there's this gap in the grain trade because of the war and the embargo. It doesn't get transmitted to other parts of the Mediterranean immediately. It gets transmitted in 1347 when they resolve this war and lift this embargo. So then you have grain shipments coming back to Italy, but what travels with grain? Rats and mice, and they have fleas. And this is how you end up with plague transmission in Europe, starting just an explosion in 1347. You couldn't have it without all these layers, the volcano layer, the political layer of wars, the great trade layer, um, the timing of this. Why is it 1347 and not any other year?
Mhm.
There's this whole set of causes that are associated with one alone would not be enough, but when they all come together in this particular way, you end up with this really dramatic disease outbreak.
And this really complicated, climatic, epidemiological, economic, political. One thing that your research and the research that came out yesterday demonstrates, there's been like a much more simplistic argument about this before. I remember one thing I remember from high school history class is how at the siege of Kaffa, although I didn't know what it was called at the time, this is where the Mongols supposedly would catapult diseased bodies, kind of early bioterrorism,
Right,
right? That the story was that this was like the first use of biological warfare
right.
as a way of, and this is how, the Black Death spread from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean to the rest of Europe. And your argument is that this is a complete
It's not true.
not true.
It's not true.
Yeah.
It's not true, and there's 2 reasons why we should and why historians have been suspicious of that story.
Hmm.
The problem was not like, it was clear that there was something wrong with that story, but the difficulty was coming up with an alternative explanation, right? So the 2 problems with that story, one of them is an epidemiological explanation, right? Plague still exists in the world today. It actually exists in Arizona. But we're able to manage it quite well and not have big human outbreaks because we understand pretty well how it works. Also, antibiotics are effective against plague. Um, but we know that it's generally not transmitted from dead humans to living humans. It's usually transmitted through some kind of rodent, rats, mice, also marmots, prairie dogs, other kinds of mammals are possible,
Mhm.
and then through some kind of insect, so usually fleas, possibly lice. There are other kinds of insects that could be candidates. Um, that's the normal mode for it's usually transmitted from animals to people via insects. Um, it's technically possible to transmit human to human if someone has pneumonic plague, so they're coughing. You can cough on someone else if you cough. It's not actually very contagious, but if you cough right in someone's face, you can give them plague. But the idea that dead bodies catapulted over the wall would transmit plague from a modern medical perspective, this doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's actually a medieval military history problem with this as well, which is this is the only siege where anything like this is ever reported. Like we look at other Mongol sieges of other cities and they don't do this. Um, when body parts are put in catapults, it tends to be heads only, and the goal is psychological
Mhm.
terror rather than biological terror,
Terrifying people.
right? So it it doesn't add up on the military history side, and it also doesn't add up on the modern biology side either. Plus, there's that story about catapulting bodies comes from one source written by Gabriele de Musi. Gabriele de Musi was a notary, a legal professional, right, in Piacenza, and he did witness the Black Death outbreak, so his descriptions of things that happened in Piacenza, it's a perfectly good description, but he never went to Caffa, and we know for a fact that he never went to Caffa because he's a notary, and so his job every day is to write legal documents, and they all have dates on them,
Wow.
and so we know what he was doing in the first half of the 1340s, and he was in Piacenza, right? Piacenza is not it's in Italy, it's nowhere close to Cava. So he is reporting some kind of garbled gossip, right? There was a siege in Cava. There were Tatars involved. This has something to do with the plague. Um, but the particular details of that story are not correct. And so the question is, what alternatives do we have? What better sources do we have? And in fact, we have a huge amount of written documentation from the Black Sea. So that was what I wanted to do in my research was to find better sources than this catapulting bodies. source, and they exist.
Hmm. Earlier I described your research as epic, and I stand by that. Thinking about this really close, interrelated relationship between the environment, between politics, between emotion, it's
Mhm.
friendship or, tension, enmity. Um, to kind of switch topics, and how do you teach this? What when you teach these very complicated, continent spanning, environmental, emotional, political narratives. How do you convey this to your students, and what do you want them to take from this?
So on the Black Death side of things, I want them to see how interdisciplinary this work is. There's been this wave of new studies on the Black Death, and my work is one piece of it, but there's this article that just came out, but over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been, uh, huge breakthroughs, and this involves our biological understanding of how Yersinia pestis, the bacteria, works. It involves ancient DNA to understand how that bacteria has evolved over time. It involves archaeology to understand what is the impact of this bacteria on specific communities at specific times.
Mhm.
It involves historians to explain what does this mean to people? How do they see it at the time? How do they interpret it? It involves people who study the environment in order to understand these climate factors like the volcanoes, but also the animal-human relations. How and when does it jump from animal populations into human populations? So on the one hand, this is very complex. On the other hand, there's certain key questions that come out of it, and they are all questions where we have to be working together. So the people studying ancient DNA will come up with some new information, and this causes historians to ask a new set of questions. Or historians will start looking at the documents in a different way and come up with this narrative about the grain trade, right? That causes the scientists to go back and look in different places than they hadn't looked before. So it really is an interdisciplinary conversation, and when I'm teaching it, that's what I want students to see, that there are so many pieces to this puzzle. One scholar is only gonna contribute a few pieces here and there, but you put them all together and it creates this completely new and different picture, and that is really exciting.
Well, one of the things that I love about reading your work is how you're able to convey that complexity, but also just kind of give us a sense that granular detail of lived experience. And it's just been a true pleasure talking with you about your research today. And I'm very excited to see how it continues, and just want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.